You are listening to Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society. My name is Jeremy D'Entremont. Welcome. Today is July 21st, 2024, and this is episode 287 of Lighthearted. My co-host today is Averie Shaughnessy-Comfort, Executive Director of the Presque Isle Light Station in Pennsylvania. Welcome back, Averie.
Happy to be back. Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
So in a few minutes, we will listen to a conversation with one of the top experts on Great Lakes Lighthouses. Averie, you last co-hosted in September of last year. Hard to believe it's been almost a year, and it's great to have you back.
It's great to be back. It is hard to believe it's almost been a year already. I have a hard time believing it's July of 2024, honestly.
Well, it feels like July. We'll get to that in a moment. Your organization, in case people don't know, takes care of 3 historic lighthouses in Pennsylvania on Lake Erie: the Erie Land Lighthouse, Presque Isle Lighthouse, and the Erie Harbor North Pierhead Light. I hope I got that all correct.
You did.
Okay. And I'm always nervous about saying Presque Isle because there's several Presque Isles, and at least one of them pronounces it Presque Isle, which is more like the French pronunciation. But you do say Isle, right? Presque Isle?
We do say Presque Isle, and we hear every kind of pronunciation from any possible kind.
I can imagine. Presque Isle, maybe?
Presque Isle is our favorite one.
Yeah. I'm sure there's a lot, but anyway, as we was just alluding to, it's very hot here in the New Hampshire seacoast. It's been crazy hot lately, with a lot of days in the 90s and very humid. How's this summer going there, weather-wise?
About the same, Jeremy. We've also had temperatures in the 90s with very high humidity, but we've had some great weather for people to be out on the beaches, which usually lends itself to people visiting our lighthouses. So we can't complain, really.
Yeah, well, you can, but but there's a good side to it for sure. I'm sure there's I live a few miles from a very popular beach resort called Hampton Beach here in New Hampshire. I'm sure it is absolutely mobbed most of these days lately. So I'm wondering if you have any events coming up, any news, anything to do with the lighthouses there?
Yeah, we've got quite a lot happening, actually. We have preservation work happening at both the Presque Isle Lighthouse and the Erie Land Lighthouse. At Presque Isle, we are almost finished with our restoration work going back to the era of 1900 to 1920. The last bit of that work was our summer kitchen. So in about a few more weeks or so, we'll be completed with that project, and the house will look like it did back whenever Andrew Shaw, our longest-serving keeper, was serving in the lighthouse. So that's very exciting.
That is. Wow, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not going to make it there this year, but I'm going to put it on my list for next year. I really, really want to make it there and see, not only see it for the first time, but see this restoration that's happening. So let's talk about today's interview. Our guest today, Larry Wright, actually lives in Ontario, although he also spends a lot of time in Florida. He lives on the Canadian side of the border, obviously, but he's written about and photographed lighthouses, Great Lakes lighthouses on both sides of the border. In fact, as we talk about in the interview, he has photographed all but one of the Great Lakes lighthouses, and there's way over 400, so that's pretty impressive. So
I wonder what the last one is.
I think I remember what it is, but I don't want to say it. Well, people have to listen to find out. But,
okay, getting ahead of myself there.
Yeah, it's okay. So have you been to any of the Great Lakes lighthouses over on the Canadian side of the border, by any chance?
I have not. That's one of my goals, to get to the Canadian side of the border. We reference Long Point, Ontario all of the time in Erie because it's our closest landmass from Erie, PA to the Canadian side. So at some point, I would love to make it to Long Point to see their lighthouse, since we reference it so often. Yeah.
Well, you've got some time to catch up to Larry Wright and see all. I think he said 471 lighthouses on the Great Lakes, counting both sides. So yeah,
I got some time.
He's been doing it a while. So let's move on to today's interview. If you could, please help me out with the introduction for Larry Wright.
Sure, Jeremy. Larry Wright is a National Gold Medal award-winning photographer who has been involved with lighthouse preservation since 1991. He was on the board of directors for the Great Lakes Lighthouse Keepers Association, based in Mackinac, Michigan, for about 20 years.
Larry also has a shipmaster's license to pilot and captain, and he is a qualified engineer for selected passenger vessels. Larry has co-written 4 books about lighthouses on the Great Lakes, along with his wife, Pat. They are the Great Lakes Lighthouses Encyclopedia, Bonfires and Beacons, and Bright Lights, Dark Nights. I love those titles. He also, as I said, 4 books. So the 4th one was Lightships of the Great Lakes. His articles have been published in a number of U.S., British, and Canadian publications.
Larry is currently working on a project called Chronicles of Lighthouses on the Great Lakes. The Chronicles have now exceeded 9,000 pages, and when finished, Larry says it will be about 12,000 pages. The Chronicles will be housed at a number of universities and nonprofit museums, as well as lighthouse organizations.
I just can't get over the 12,000 pages.
That's a lot of pages.
Yeah, well, it's not. It will be available to researchers, as you just said, but won't exactly be published as a book you can buy on Amazon or whatever. That's just impossible. But it's a tremendous amount of material that he's put together over the years. It'll be valuable for many years to come. So I've been a fan of Larry's books for years. Going back a couple of decades. In fact, we actually met more than 20 years ago, as we talk about in the interview, and it was great to talk with him again recently. So let's listen to my conversation with Larry Wright now. I'm speaking today with Larry Wright. Larry is really one of the great experts on Great Lakes lighthouses, and we're going to talk about that today. And Larry and I were just kind of talking on the side, and we realized that we met like 24 years ago in Nova Scotia at a conference. Well, first of all, let me thank you for doing this today, Larry. Good to see you.
My pleasure.
Yeah, as we were saying, we were both at a Nova Scotia conference in the year 2000, and we went on a boat ride together at Presque Isle Lighthouse. And that lighthouse, I think, isn't there anymore.
Yeah, well, that's what I heard. It's gone.
Yeah, but that was a good day. I remember that very well. The late Rip Irwin, who was a local expert on lighthouses there, took us out. So it was nice to remember that, and it's good to see you again. I think this has been 24 years since we last saw each other. So I'm going to ask you, start out with a really obvious question that I'm sure you've been asked like 1,000 times, if not 1,000,000 times. That question is, how did you get so interested in lighthouses?
Well, I was taking a photography course back in about 76, and the chap that was taking us around, he had a boat on Georgian Bay, and one of the first places we went to was a lighthouse to spend the afternoon photographing the lighthouse and the windswept pines on the island and stuff like that. And then it kind of grew from there. Mm-hmm. And it's just been a passion of mine for 40 years, I guess.
Yeah.
And then later on, we went up to the North Channel of Georgian Bay, which is a part of Lake Huron, and photographed a lighthouse on Badgley Island. And that was kind of neat. It was an abandoned one. And I left it at that. And a few years later, I decided I wanted to go back and re-photograph that lighthouse on that island, only to find out that the Coast Guard went in one Sunday morning and dynamited it. And that was the end of the lighthouse. So that was kind of what got me, well, maybe I should photograph a few more.
Before they're gone.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, well, that's cool. And the rest is history. But you also have a shipmaster's license, if I have that right?
Yeah, I've my master's license or captain's license for tour boats.
So have you done a lot of that kind of thing over the years as well?
I did it for about 10 years. I've just retired from doing that a year ago. Mm-hmm. But I did it for 11 seasons. And I have spent a number of months on Algoma boats on the Great Lakes.
And you're also qualified as an engineer for some vessels, is that right?
Yeah, I'm a licensed engineer for a number of specific boats. Every time you can get a license, it's designated against a specific boat or ship.
So you've seen this stuff, the maritime history and the current maritime scene of the Great Lakes, from a lot of different angles over the years.
Correct. Yes.
literally. I'm different angles on land and air and sea as well.
Yeah.
So here's another question that you probably get asked a lot, but I don't know the answer to this. How many lighthouses on the Great Lakes, combining the American and Canadian side?
I was working trying to figure that out myself. Currently, there's about 471 still existing on the lakes. But I figured there was close to 680 or more. And then there was also 41 over a course of the years, 41 lightships on the lakes.
Wow.
That kind of go unmentioned in most things.
I'm sure a lot of listeners know about the lightships on the east and west coasts of the U.S., but not so much about the ones on the Great Lakes. That's really interesting. Maybe we can do another podcast episode just about those sometime, because that's a big subject on its own as well. Yeah, one thing I've learned over the years is that you don't make absolute statements about lighthouses. And it's also, as far as the number of lighthouses on the Great Lakes or in the country or whatever, it depends on your definition of a lighthouse. And there's a lot of disagreement about that. Yeah. So
and that's always the hard thing. And when I refer to the lighthouses on the Great Lakes, I refer to them down the St. Lawrence as far as the fresh water goes, or the sweet water. The sweet water ends somewhere between Montreal and Quebec City. So, and of course, that's the Canadian side of it. The American side ends at Ogdensburg. Is where the American side of the lighthouses start. So, which is quite a bit up the St. Lawrence.
Right. Yeah, it's another part of the equation. What do you exactly to consider the borders of the Great Lakes? Yeah. Let me ask you another general question. What for you is most interesting? What makes the lighthouses in the Great Lakes so interesting?
I think it was just the fact that there were so many of them, more so on the American side than the Canadian side. The architecture of the lights are quite different. You've got the styles like up in Split Rock, where its interior is glazed brick, and it's the only lighthouse that I can think of that has glazed brick on the interior, to wooden structures that the Canadians built, salt and pepper shaker type shapes with a keeper's house attached. And the Canadians, we were a little more frugal with our limited funds, and so they would build lighthouses that they could tear down and move from one island to the other. And they did that, like at Gin Rocks and Brebeuf Island, and that if they found the lighthouse or the shipping channel had changed, they just pick up and move the lighthouse. Where I found on the U.S. side, the lights were more permanent and strong brick, tall stone, much more substantial lighthouses than most of the Canadian lighthouses.
Oh, it's a good variety, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Remind me, where do you live?
I live in a little village called Blythe, Ontario. It's about 20 minutes from Goderich on Lake Huron. So I'm about 15 miles away the crow flies from Lake Huron.
But you've been very involved with the lighthouses on both sides of the border there for years and years. Yeah. Have you photographed every lighthouse on the Great Lakes?
All but one.
Okay. I was thinking, can I guess what it is? And I'm sure you photographed Standard Rock probably by flying over it.
No, I actually went out and boated out to it.
Okay.
The one I missed is Squaw Island in Lake Michigan, and we were going out to it, and the boat had a prop problem, and we never got there that day, and it was unfortunate, but that's the only one I haven't got back to.
Are you going to get there one of these days?
Maybe someday. I'm hoping to.
That's funny. So as we were just saying, you photographed and written about lighthouses on both the Canadian and American side of the Great Lakes. I guess you don't really see it as separate. I mean, it's all part of the same whole, right? All part of the same network, sort of.
Yeah, it's all part of the same navigation, aids to navigation. Sometimes I separate them, and sometimes I don't. From a writing point of view, I don't separate them. From a travel point of view, if I'm hopping in my car and going to Michigan, I'm touring the Michigan Lights as I go along, or the same on the Canadian side. The difference is some of it is architecture, but the difference between U.S. lighthouse and the Canadian was on the American side. It was what I call quasi-military, even back in the 1840s and 1850s, where the Canadian lighthouses were never under any real control. It was non-uniform. If you wore what you had on, you had to look respectable in case somebody came for a tour. But and the lighthouse keepers were not really supported that well here on the Great Lakes. It's Ontario, really. On the Ontario side, unfortunately, it should have been a little more controlled and regulated and taken it seriously. They were thinking, you're out there, you're gone, we forget about you. And on the American side, you were either part of the Navy at different points, or the Coast Guard.
Yeah, from what I've read, a lot of those early Canadian keepers were kind of like pioneers in a lot of these areas. Maybe I'm sure on the Great Lakes, but maybe especially in British Columbia, I've read about the tough times some of them went through, the early ones there.
Oh, on the Great Lakes, it was pretty tough. North of Superior and areas like that, we lost a lot of light keepers through starvation, through foul weather, or injury, where there was no rescue for them. One keeper up at the west end of Superior was out of food, and they couldn't. And he was supposed to be coming off at the end of or the middle of December. They couldn't get to him because of the bad weather, and he didn't make it. A lot of years, probably right up to about 1920 or so, it was the keeper's responsibility to get in and out of his lighthouse in the spring and the fall. And if you're 50 miles out in Lake Superior, you're on your own, buddy, in a little 18-foot sailboat. And a lot of them perished that way, or they get to the shore, but there was no community around, and they would perish just trying to get to the rail line.
Was there friction with the Native Americans early on? No, it's not Native Americans, Native Canadians, I should say.
No.
Well, Native Americans too, on both sides.
Yeah. They kind of free flow there. Not a lot. There was a bit. The Canadian government, or Canada West, or Upper Canada, depending on the time period, would, I think, just arbitrarily, we need a lighthouse here, we'll build it, and we'll worry about who owns the land after the fact. So we did have some issues with some lighthouses where, for example, Hope Island, they wanted to increase the land area for the keeper so he could have a bit of a farm to have a cow on, and stuff like that, where the First Nations kind of balked at that. But most of the time, it was just arguing over how much the land was worth, 30 years after the lighthouse was built. Do we pay that price, or do we pay the 1850 price? Or
So, Larry, let me ask you, first of all, I've got three of your books right here next to me, the Lighthouse Encyclopedia and Bonfires and Beacons and Bright Lights, Dark Nights. And I believe in all three, your wife, Patricia, is credited as co-author of those books,
yes.
Right?
Yeah. When we got into it, we decided that it was going to be a joint effort, and the publisher decided we could do it as a joint effort. She's got 2 degrees, and one's in English, and I don't have a degree, and my spelling is atrocious. So we decided that I would do the research. She would travel around with me. She could do interviews, and we would just work together on it. I got to do all the typing and the editing, and which I thought was the hardest job. And we worked together pretty well. We were being interviewed one time, national radio, and they said, how long you guys been married? And I told them, and they said, and you're doing this together? Yeah, yep. And he says, how could you have such success? And it was a simple answer. I just hit all the sharp knives.
How many years have you been married now?
52.
Congratulations. Wow. That's great. So she was pretty much the writer. Of course, as you said, you were the editor, but you took all the photographs in these books, right?
Yeah, I took all the photographs, and I did most of the interviews, and just all the research pretty
Mm-hmm.
well.
Yeah.
So,
Well, the research is probably the hardest and the most time consuming part of it all.
yeah, it is. But I think it's the most fun
Uh-huh.
because when we were doing it, we could be in Buffalo and find out something about the Duluth Lighthouse, or we could be in Thunder Bay and find out something about Point Clark Lighthouse. And, you never knew where you were going to find morsels of information. Yeah, and when I first started doing the research, I had a focus on, for example, in Bonfires and Beacons, just those lights in Bonfires and Beacons, and I'd be someplace and I wouldn't bother taking down the information on some other lighthouses, and then I was kicking myself after. I got to go back, and you go back to the Chicago Library and say, I need this, and they say, oh, we don't have that. Yeah, you do.
Well,
Can I help you find it?
yeah,
Let me in the room.
yeah. I kind of know what that's like dealing with various libraries and historical societies that,
Yeah.
not to fault the Chicago Library in particular, but a lot of these places, the materials are not that well organized. You just kind of got to go through boxes or envelopes full of papers and things like that. Yeah. It's like finding treasure though, when you find something good, right?
It really is. It really is.
Yeah. So your first two books, the Bonfires and Beacons and Bright Lights, Dark Nights, are great. I love them. Excellent photography and good source of information. But then you did the Great Lakes Lighthouses Encyclopedia, which is literally a weighty book. I've got it right here and I'm picking it up, and it probably weighs, I don't know, 10 pounds or something. And it's how many pages? A few hundred pages, almost 450 pages, something like that. So how long did it take you to research and put that one together?
That was probably, I like to say 5 and 20 years, 5 years to put it together, but 20 years of research. It was like when we were doing the other two books, boy, there's a lot of information out here. There's a lot of stories to be told and some fun stuff, some tragedy. After Bright Lights, Dark Nights, we did another book. When I was sitting with the publishers, we got talking about doing a big book, like a real book, a big book. And the third book never went to the printers. It was just pushed into the encyclopedia, and then we had to sit down. I had to sit down and go through every lighthouse on the Great Lakes and try to put as much as we could in. And it could have been 10 times the size of it because it was like the publisher, you got to make it fit that page.
Yeah, right. It's really an impressive piece of work. But even more so, well, before I get to what I was just going to ask, you also did a book on Great Lakes Lightships. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. What was the title of that one?
Great Lakes
Lightships of the Great Lakes, Great Lakes Lightships. Yeah. Good. Very clever. Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty simple. Mm-hmm. And that was a fun one to do too. I got linked up with University of Detroit, and I got into their archives. They invited me down, and they have a absolutely fabulous photo collection done by Father Dowling out of Chicago, and I could have spent months there going through the stuff that they had. It was just incredible, and I really appreciated the time they gave me and the help they gave me.
That's great. I'd love to find a copy of your Lightship book. It's the one I don't have, so I need to get that. Plus, it's fascinating, and lightships don't get the attention they deserve, really. I think a lot of lighthouse buffs are aware of them, but maybe not as aware as they could be, I'd say.
There's not too many of them survived. I mean, on the Great Lakes, there's only one survivor, and that's the Huron lightship that's on display at Fort Huron. And that's the only surviving lightship on the Great Lakes. And they were moved around. Sometimes the same lightship would be used in different locations depending on the year or the need.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, the general public didn't see the lightships very often.
Yeah.
With lighthouses, especially on the U.S. side of the Great Lakes, they're land based, but a lightship is out in the middle of the water, so they get less attention, less interest in them.
Yeah. You said there were what, 40 or more on the Great Lakes at one time?
Off and on over the course of the lightship lifespan, there was 41 of them.
Wow. Yeah.
And some of them were only used for a few months to mark a shipwreck, so that, once that ship was either removed or destroyed, or they would remove the lightship once the navigation was cleared to travel through there.
Yeah. So let's talk about your project, the Chronicles of Lighthouses on the Great Lakes. You were telling me about this in emails lately. Tell me again how many pages that's gotten up to.
Well, right now it's 9,500 pages of data on all the lighthouses on the Great Lakes. And when I finish it, it should be, if I live that long, about 13,000 pages.
Hmm. And this is, you say data, is it like collections? I shouldn't say just, but it's collections of information on all the lighthouses. It's not written in the sense of like a narrative form, like for a book or something like that.
Well,
right?
For the most part, no, it's not written in a narrative. I do add some narrative. It is the data, historical data on all the lights, as much as I can have been able to find. But I've also tried to incorporate the light keepers in it as well. If I have information about a certain light keeper at a certain lighthouse, I'll put that in it and make that part of the bundle. And if I can find photographs of the keepers, I'll add the keepers' photographs into it as well. In essence, it's really a research publication, and I've made it available to many of the museums around, and the goal is to get it into the hands of 3 or 4 universities. CMU has asked me they actually asked me for all my material at one point, and Queen's University and associations. If you're a group that for example, Point Clark Lighthouse Group, if you want what I've got, 120 or 30 pages of data, it's yours. All you have to do is ask. I did the same with Nanawasaga and Chantry Island, and I sent Toronto Parks. There's on the Toronto Island Lighthouse, or Lighthouse Point Lighthouse, depending on what name you want to call it.
Yeah. So is this in digital form or just hard copies, or what form?
It's in digital form right now. I've done hard copies on sections of it, but I've not at this point found a sponsor that wants to pay.
Yeah, it's a lot of printers printing ink.
Yeah,
for
a
that.
lot of expense. Yeah.
Yeah, but these days it's probably at least as useful as a digital document that you can share more easily than actually to have it on paper. Yeah. And I'll mention that I'm very involved with the U.S. Lighthouse Society digital archives, and we would love to have that in the digital archives, if that's a possibility, which would give researchers another way of accessing it as well.
Yeah, we'll make it available for them.
Okay, let's not forget to discuss that later. So thank you. So part of the reason I'm talking with you today, when it was overdue anyway, being one of the Great Lakes Lighthouse guys, I'm really glad I'm doing this. But also Savannah, who I believe is the coordinator at Point Clark Lighthouse in Ontario. I don't know her last name, but the first name is Savannah. I'm not talking about Savannah, Georgia. She's, again, the coordinator at Point Clark Lighthouse in Ontario, and she referred me to you as I had contacted them about maybe doing something in the podcast, and she said, well, you're the expert. Larry Wright is the expert. You got to contact him. You don't have an official role with them, right? But you've been like an advisor. Is that right?
No, this year I don't have an official role with them at all. I helped them with a training lesson the other day, and that I did work for them a year ago But this year I'm trying to retire. I'll be 75 in a couple of days, and I want to make sure
Yeah.
that I get this other project done first.
Well, good luck with that. I haven't figured out how to do it. I'm a little bit behind you, but not that much. And I don't see retirement on the horizon for me yet. So anyway, I understand. And let's talk a little bit more about Point Clark. What do you think is special or unique about Point Clark Lighthouse? And first of all, if you could, for people who don't know, just give briefly explain where it is.
Okay, Point Clark is on Lake Huron, on the eastern shores of Lake Huron, about 30 minutes north of the town of Godrich. It's on a bit of a point that juts out into Lake Huron. The nearest major town to it is Kincardine or Southampton. If somebody wanted to look up on a digital map, they'll be able to kind of pinpoint it there. Point Clark Lighthouse is one of what is called the Imperial Six. Now, the Imperial Six is a bit of a misnomer because there was more than that Imperial towers built. John Brown had the contract in 1856 to build these 6 towers, but in 1847 he built the tower on Mohawk Island in Lake Erie, which was considered an Imperial tower. He also was involved with building a couple other stone towers. The one at Burlington, under the Skyway Bridge there, was built in 1858, the same time he built the other 6. And the Burlington light is identical to the Christian Island light, which is part of the Imperial Towers. The earliest record I have of an Imperial Tower being built on the Great Lakes was 1833, and there was 2 stone towers built in the same year, and then there was another stone tower built on Pelee Island in around 1831, 1832. The Imperial Six, the Chantry Island, Point Clark, Nottawasaga, Cove Island, Christian, and Griffiths Island are all built by Brown under the same contract. The original contract was to build 11 lighthouses at the same time, and they ended up only doing 6 because the cost factor was just astronomical. They were building these lighthouses where there was no charts, and it was kind of like you're going to the wilderness to build these, and trying to get staff and people to stay. He was having to pay a premium just to keep people on at the different locations, and then there was logistics trying to get the stone from here to there, and then even getting the lantern lenses, and they came from solder in Paris. There was delays receiving them and that, so there was a lot of cost overrun. And by 1857, John Brown had wrote the government saying he needed some relief from his contract because he was not going to be able to survive building 11 of them. He was losing money on every one of them, but not a lot of money. And many people used to say that he was going to go bankrupt if he didn't get help. And in reality, he wasn't going to go bankrupt. He was just not making money on his projects. So he died a few years later, a pretty wealthy man. John Brown was also involved with building the Welland Canal and a railway across southern Ontario, and so he was hurting on the job, but not hurting too bad.
Tell me again, what's the material we're talking about? The kind of stone
It's limestone, cut limestone and chiseled and hammered outside surface. The blocks were about 19 inches high by as much as 2 feet long, and they're curved. And that the towers were built, most of them were built on a good solid foundation of hard bedrock. But Point Clark, they thought they'd only have to go down 5 or 6 feet. Well, they ended up down between 60 and 70 feet to get a foundation. So they had to pile drive hemlock pillars in underneath it to support the tower.
Isn't limestone porous and not really the best stone for building?
Well, yeah, granite's a little harder. Yeah, but limestone is porous, but it does breathe. But it did create issues. Obviously, Point Clark, they replaced over 400 stones a couple of years ago, and there's 1,400 stones in the tower, and they had to replace 400. Nottawasaga had an issue where the walls came down a few years back, caused from weather and water being trapped inside. There's theories about why the water got into it or the moisture got in it and stayed. Originally, the lighthouses were not painted or whitewashed, but in 1871 they started to whitewash them, and it was a combination of whitewash and salt to get it to stick, and that seemed to work well and breathe. But at some point, and I can't pinpoint it exactly, but around the 1930s or so, they stopped doing whitewash and they started to paint. And this is just my personal opinion. I think the paint trapped the moisture in and didn't allow it to escape. So in the wintertime, when it would freeze, it would cause the stone to crack.
And you mentioned the restoration of Point Clark Lighthouse. That was a really big deal. You say like 400 of the blocks were replaced.
They replaced the stone, and that was a project in itself. But every stone that had been cut and pre-fitted, after they did that, they took them out and sent them to Toronto to have them recut to fit perfectly, and then brought back from Toronto to Point Clark, inserted, and they were all number encoded and that. And after they were inserted and finished, then they did the hammer finish on them so that it would look like the rest of the stones on it. Some of them are a little smoother than the others, but they looks pretty original.
So at Point Clark, I believe there's a museum in the former
Yes.
keeper's house there. Is that something
Yep.
you've been involved with?
I didn't have any involvement when it was set up. After it got reorganized, I've been able to acquire some artifacts for them, which is kind of fun to do. I would have people coming into the lighthouse. Oh, my great grandfather did this, or my uncle did that, and well, do you have any history, or do you have anything you want to share with us? And sometimes they'll bring in pieces that they've had. One of the neighbors up there was in one day, and he says, "Oh, I have all the slate off the old slate roof under my cottage." Really? Suppose we could get a couple pieces just for display. This has got a steel roof on the keeper's house now.
Again, that's like finding treasure.
Yeah.
You never know what's going to come your way, for sure. So before we move on to other subjects, anything else about Point Clark? I know every one of these has tremendous history, and that's why you have they're going to have 12,000 pages on these things.
Yeah.
But anything about Point Clark that really stands out as far as maybe the human history, keepers, families there?
Oh yeah, there's all sorts of wonderful stories. The first keeper, there was two keepers there, and Young and Gilby, and they did not get along, and they were always calling on their superiors, their Wright and their superiors, I guess you would say, and saying, "I can't work with him. He's got to go." And he's doing this, and well, that guy's drinking, and that guy's doing this, back and forth. So there was right off the bat, there was conflict with the keepers, and after that was resolved, and they sent the one guy down to Wolf Island. They decided that there would only be one keeper at that lighthouse forevermore. The keepers' kids were probably as much fun as the keepers. There's the story of one of the keeper's two sons, climbing the tower, which is 90 some feet tall, climbing up the outside using the lightning rod cable. And they got up to the gallery, couldn't get in the gallery door because it was locked from the inside, so they had to climb back down. And Dad was not a happy camper when he found out that the boys did this. And And then there's the keeper's wives. A couple of the keeper's wives would serve dinners and charge 25 cents for a meal. Point Clark at its peak was getting about 1,000 visitors on a weekend there, which is pretty good for back 75, 100 years ago. Then there's a story. I don't know. Do a lot of kids watch your podcast?
I know of one.
Okay.
Gwen, who's 11 years old and lives in Kentucky. She's actually co-hosted episodes with me as well.
Good. Well,
she may be the only regular listener at that age, but maybe there's others.
I'll tell you the story, and then you can decide. The lighthouse is 9 stories tall, and one of the keeper's 2 sons decided that he had this kitten, and he was going to see about parachuting the kitten off the top of the tower, off the gallery. And so he took the kitten in a basket and an umbrella up to the top, hooked the basket to the umbrella, put the kitten in, and opened the umbrella, and down it went. At some point, the cat jumped out of the basket, but we're not sure whether the cat survived. My theory is it was 9 stories tall, but they only dropped him off the 8th story, and a cat has 9 lives. So I'm thinking that's 1, that's 2, that's 3, and he was safe at the bottom.
Wow. Well, cats have an amazing, obviously they have that famous ability to right themselves as they're falling and land on their feet. But I like to think the cat didn't jump out until near the ground.
Near
and
the
it was
bottom.
perfectly fine. I'll believe that. I don't want to think about that anymore. But this is a tough question because there are, as you said, over 400 lighthouses in the Great Lakes, and each of them has a story or many, many stories to tell. But if you could give a sampling of just what you think are some of the most interesting or dramatic or funny stories about lighthouse keepers on the Great Lakes. And again, that's way too big a question to expect just a few minutes, but just what comes to mind first?
One of the things that comes to mind is Forgotten East End lighthouse up in Lake Superior. The Sherlock family were out there, and one day the keeper, he goes running up the door, and his wife says, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" He says, "I'm going for a ride on a beaver tail." And a big old beaver come up, and he went out and jumped on it and lassoed it and rode on the tail back down to the water.
Okay.
Just you don't expect to do that. But in the Sherlocks, when they're out there, the season for gardening was pretty short, and they had come across an old wrecked wooden boat, and they brought it up to the lighthouse, and then went way back into the island and far in, and dug up topsoil and brought it out and planted it, put it in the boat, and then they planted tomatoes. And Sherlock and his brother in Sault Ste. Marie were always in an argument who had the first tomatoes on their tomato plants. Well, Sherlock would just blow up balloons and little red balloons and tie them to the tomato plant, take a picture, and send it to his brother. See, that I've got the first tomatoes. Yeah. He never got tomatoes plants because the season was too short. And there was farther up in Superior, there was a lighthouse keeper who got in real trouble with the Marine Department because he ran a wire down from the lighthouse to the keeper's house and put in one light bulb in the kitchen so he could see to read. He almost lost his job for stealing hydro from the Canadian government.
Wow.
There's just so many.
Yeah.
The guys out on some of the remote islands in Lake Superior trying to make it to shore in the fall. 1st of December, the weather is just terrible, and they would get it. They may get their boats to shore if they didn't perish on Superior, and they would be found dead, frozen up against a tree, or they would be 7 or 8 days getting from the lighthouse to shore. because the ice flows were moving them around and different things. 1922 or about 1919, the lightkeepers got together and started to protest and asked that they be taken to their assignments and picked up from their assignments. And the Canadian government finally relented and said, okay, we'll do that. So in 1922 on Lake Superior, they loaded up the little tug, 102-foot tug, a Lambton, and sent it off with five. It had 5 keepers in it, a whole crew on it. There was 22 people on it, and the ship perished. And this was kind of the first of the consolidated effort to take keepers to their lighthouses, and they never made it.
I always tell people lighthouse keeping wasn't as romantic as you think. I hear people say, "Oh, I would have loved to be a lighthouse keeper." Well, careful what you wish for. Of course, it's not even possible anymore. But overall, it was a difficult and dangerous way to make a living.
Difficult, dangerous, and quite boring at times. Quite depressing. There are a lot of stories of different keepers at different lighthouses committing suicide.
Yeah.
The Coast Guard or the Canadian Coast Guard would find them dead on the ground where they've actually jumped off the tower.
Wow.
That happened more than they like to let on. It was pretty remote, and some of them you were the only person out there, and maybe during the summer your family would be there during July and August, and then you're gone, and then you would be there in isolation to the end of the season.
They probably had some really tough winters in those days, I'm sure. Yeah.
There's a few keepers that tried to survive, stay at their stations year round, and most of them never survived.
Yeah,
the long winters.
Wow. Moving on here, and again, a lot of these stories and many, many more are in your books. So people would want to find those. But people are always surprised when I ask, what's the state with the most lighthouses? They always say, oh, Maine, Florida, Massachusetts. Of course, Michigan has more lighthouses than any U.S. state. And I think a lot of lighthouse buffs don't realize there's well over 400 lighthouses on the Great Lakes. So just absolutely tremendous history and so much interesting human history. So
the American rule of thumb, I think, was every 30 miles there had to be a lighthouse. So a ship traveling could either see one to the light from the stern or from the bow to give them directions.
Yeah, they wanted to never be out of sight of a lighthouse. Yeah. So let's move on here. Tell me about your involvement with the Great Lakes Lighthouse Keepers Association, which has been around for I think more than 40 years now. It's also known as GLICA, Gllka. I believe you're on the board of directors for something like 20 years or so. What has been your involvement there? Any particular projects you worked on with them?
No one specific project. I was involved, before I was on the board of directors, I was involved with setting up their conferences for Lake Ontario and Lake Erie and Lake Huron. But once I was on the board, I was just, I guess, a member at large. I was a Canadian contingent to the board. Mm-hmm. And so some of the stuff I could input the different views or the different factions. Well, this is the Canadian government operates this way, where the U.S. government operates in a different manner, and I could do some comparisons. And sometimes when we were working on statutes and laws and that, it was like, this is a little different than what we can do with. And it was just trying to expand what they were doing for the different associations on the Great Lakes.
Well, it's good they had you for the Canadian viewpoint there. So you've visited hundreds of lighthouses. You've photographed hundreds of lighthouses from all different kinds of angles and everything, again, from air, land, and sea. I'm sure some of the same lighthouses you probably photographed from air, land, and sea. Are there any stories that stand out for you as far as accessing some of these places?
Oh, oh yeah.
Yeah.
I remember the Toledo Lighthouse. I was, it was a February day that I decided that I'm going to rent a plane and go out. So I got a hold of this charter outside of Detroit, south of Detroit, and we're going out to photograph it and West Sister Island and a couple others. And we're circling around over Toledo, and the door opens, and I'm hanging there by my belt and my camera. And I was kidding with the pilot. And I said to him, I said, if I fall, and I'd just been a pinhole in the ice. And he says, and I wasn't even up flying today.
Right. Wow.
And we were out. I took a flight out of Thunder Bay the one time. And I said to my wife, do you want to come with us? And she says, no, I'm staying on terra firma here. And so we went up, and we were doing the lighthouses around Isle Royale down to Rock Ages and so on and so forth. And when we started to come back, I was still photographing. My camera quit. Absolutely just went dead. And I couldn't figure out why it just did that. And we looked off in the horizon, and we could see 5 thunderstorm cells coming towards us. And we're trying to make it back to Thunder Bay. And we were actually just zigzagging in and around the thunderstorm cells. And I said something to the pilot, and he says, the worst thing is flying up here when there's lightning. He says, I hate it. And I'm going, and the funny part was when we got back almost on the ground at Thunder Bay, my camera started to work again. It was
wow.
There must have been enough electricity
Charge
in the air.
That,
just right. And the one time we went to Slade Island with an ex-Coast Guard guy, and we got out about 8 miles, and it was foggy and it was rainy, but we were out there, and it wasn't too bad, but we were soaking wet. A cold Superior rain. We finally get back to shore, and I take my hats off to the guy that was driving the boat, because he came back to shore within a few feet of where we left in the fog. And he was ex-Coast Guard, so he was really good at his job. But I get to shore, and my wife's not there. So I hitched a ride back to where we were staying at a campground, and she's not there either. Where is she gone? I'm soaking wet. I'm cold. I'm chilled. And she had been out interviewing one of the ex-lighthouse keepers' wives. And of course, she said, well, you need to go see so-and-so in the next town over. So she hopped in the car and went over and was interviewing him. And I'm dying of exposure.
Wow.
So there was always something going on.
Yeah. It's before cell phones, and you could tell each other what you're doing. Yeah. I have to ask this. Do you have a favorite lighthouse?
I have 2. One is, well, I actually have 3. Point Clark Lighthouse, Toronto Island Lighthouse, which is the oldest lighthouse on the Great Lakes, and Split Rock. Split Rock because it's not a big, tall lighthouse, but it's on a big, tall bluff.
Yeah.
But the interior of it is glazed brick, which is, I think, the only one that I know of that has that finish on the inside. Point Clark, because I'm kind of attached to it, and it's one of the Imperial Towers, and it's one of only 2 Imperial Towers that you can visit. And Toronto Island, and I've been fortunate enough to have that lighthouse kind of to myself for a day. They gave me the big old original key for the door, and away I went and spent a day taking pictures and climbing the tower and looking around. Yeah. And one of the things I was going to mention about Point Clark and 4 of the 6 Imperial Towers is the rainwater leaders are lion's head or gargoyles around the top. And I used to think that all 6 of the towers had it, but only 4 of the towers had it. And the only other place on the Great Lakes that has a lantern room with the gargoyles is Dunkirk, New York. It has the exact same gargoyles on it. And which I think is kind of rather unique.
There are 2 lighthouses in New England I'm aware of that had the gargoyles. One is West Quoddy Head at the easternmost point in the U.S. in Maine. Yeah. And they were gone, but they had them replicated some years ago, and it has gargoyles again at this point. The other one is Petite Manan Lighthouse, which is up towards there, pretty far north on the Maine coast. Had them originally as well, but I don't know of any others in the New England region, so it's pretty unusual.
And it just adds that little bit extra to the history of the lake. when they were building the lantern rooms for the towers, Sauter in Paris sent over 6 men to assemble the lantern room, the second order lenses, and put the last 2 rows of the top of the tower aren't limestone, they're granite to take the extra weight. And they would that took them almost a year to install the lantern, the lens, and the 2 top rows. And the second order lenses weighed about 3,750 pounds or 1,700 kilograms. So they had to be supported by that granite on the top of the limestone.
I imagine that whole part of the construction, the lanterns and lens, was more time consuming, more painstaking than the building the rest of the tower, which probably happened fairly fast.
Yeah, it didn't take them too long to put the towers up. They went up in a couple of months, actually. And considering that all those big stone blocks were hauled up by horse and pulleys, and today they use electric winches, and they're there in no time. But
yeah. Oh, it's mind-boggling to think how they built these places in the 1800s.
yeah.
So I have one, we could talk for hours, and I'd love to have you on the podcast again sometime, but I have one final question for now. This is for bonus points, okay?
Oh.
And that question is, what has been your favorite thing about your association with the lighthouses of the Great Lakes?
Boy, traveling around the Great Lakes 5 or 6 times with my wife, poking around. From me, it's the research and finding the tidbits of history that's going to be lost to the world. Keeper dies, and if he hasn't wrote it down or he hasn't done oral history, it's never coming back. Nobody's ever going to know about it. Finding old newspaper clippings, and I spent eons of time going through old newspapers in libraries, going through them in museums and online, and you just go, oh, look at this. Here's a mention of the keeper, and he did this. And just being able to record that and put it in that Chronicles so that it's hopefully preserved for a long time, and it's there for everybody to see. When I first started, there wasn't much in the way of research or information about them. I quite often had families of keepers send me letters and say, can you tell us about our grandfather? What can you tell me about your grandfather? As late as last Sunday, I met a lady. I was up at Point Clark Lighthouse, and I was just leaving and ran into a lady from Michigan, and her grandfather was a lighthouse keeper. So I said, where? And she says, up by Isle Royal, but I don't know what island he was on. And I was able to give her the name of the lighthouse he was at, and that he wasn't the head keeper, he was the second keeper. And he was there from such and such, and he did this and that. And I sent her the information. And it was just like, wow. I helped her a little bit, know a little bit of history about her family, but she helped me on the other side. And now it's recorded for anybody to find out. So I guess I'm a research history junkie.
We're talking about how it's like treasure before. It's also like a big puzzle you're always trying to put together, but it's never finished. There's always missing pieces, and there always will be, but that's what makes it fun, finding, never know where those pieces are going to come from. So I completely understand the experiences you're talking about, and it's just great. And you've done such a service for lighthouse buffs, researchers, anybody interested in Great Lakes lighthouses, and you've been one of the go-to guys for Great Lakes lighthouses for a few decades now. And this work you're doing is going to be so valuable to people for many years to come. And it's great talking with you today, Larry. Again, I hope we can do it again sometime because it's a huge subject. We're talking, we're forward to lighthouses here. There's plenty to talk about, but I think I need to wrap it up for the moment. I really appreciate you doing this today, Larry. Thank you.
I loved it. Thank you very much. I'd love to do it again.
Larry Wright's books, The Great Lakes Lighthouse Encyclopedia, Bonfires and Beacons, and Bright Lights, Dark Nights are available from Amazon and other online booksellers.
As we mentioned in the interview, Larry and I met at a conference back in 2000 in Nova Scotia. We went to a lighthouse, a boat ride out to a lighthouse together. It was nice to get reacquainted. Before we sign off, I want to mention a couple of things. First, I want to make sure everyone is aware of the second annual U.S. Lighthouse Society dance-off that's happening now. The deadline for entries is August 25th. You don't need to be a dancer. People say, I can't dance. Well, you don't need to be a dancer. I took part last year, and I'm not a dancer. So you don't need to be a dancer to take part. We're just looking for people to have fun and to share their lighthouse spirit. Check out uslhs.org. Look under What's New for details. Also, I want to mention that I'm co-leading a Southern Maine and New Hampshire tour in October. There are still a few spaces left. To find out more, go to uslhs.org and look under tours. So speaking of the dance contest, anything planned at your lighthouses maybe for the dance contest, Averie?
Oh, yes, we are definitely planning for the dance-off, and I have to tell you, I also cannot dance, but luckily a few members of my staff can, so they are coming up with some very creative ideas for the dance-off. You'll just have to wait and see what happens.
Wow, I'm very much looking forward to that. Yeah. Last year at Portsmouth Harbor Light, my local lighthouse, we had some local kids from an Irish step dancing school dance, and a few of us volunteers. I volunteer for that lighthouse, and a few of us are sort of what I'm doing I call lurching around more than dancing. Behind the Irish step dancing kids, but we all had fun.
Honestly, that will be me dancing or lurching around the lighthouse while the rest of my staff and volunteers dance. I'm very confident in their abilities, but maybe not so much in mine.
Well, that's okay. Spirit is the important thing. That's what
matters.
Yep, absolutely.
A reminder that memberships and donations to the U.S. Lighthouse Society help to support this podcast. Also, if you listen with Apple Podcasts, please rate us and give us a review.
Averie, you and I have been talking about the possibility of you being a reporter on this podcast to talk about happenings with Eastern Great Lakes Lighthouses. So looking forward to getting that going.
I'm looking forward to that as well. I am looking forward to learning a lot more about the Eastern Great Lakes Lighthouses. Maybe I can catch up to Larry Wright with his 400 plus lighthouses.
Well, you're a little bit younger. You do have some time, so don't worry about that. Before we sign off, I'd like to read a quote about the Great Lakes. It's from a book our listeners may have heard of. It's called Moby Dick by a guy named Herman Melville. So, Averie, please help me out to read this quote.
Sure. Quote, "For in their interflowing aggregate, those grand freshwater seas of ours, Erie and Ontario and Huron and Superior and Michigan, possess an ocean-like expansiveness, with many of the ocean's noblest traits, with many of its rimmed varieties of races and of climes.
They contain round archipelagos of romantic isles, even as the Polynesian waters do, in large part are shored by two great contrasting nations, as the Atlantic is. They furnish long maritime approaches to our numerous territorial colonies from the east, dotted all around their banks." Unquote. He goes on, but that's the gist of it. And of course, the point is that the Great Lakes are enormous in terms of physical area and also in terms of history and lore. Anyone interested in lighthouses needs to visit the Great Lakes, or at least read about them in books like the ones Larry Wright has written. So thank you so much for co-hosting today, Averie.
Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to being a part of the podcast in the future.
Next week's episode will focus on Key West Lighthouse in Florida. Until then, to all our regular listeners and our new ones, thanks so much for listening, and
keep a good light.
I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.